Good morning. Yes. Can I be heard in the back? Yeah. Oh, very good. Good morning. And welcome once again. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the second in our series of lectures sponsored by the Master of Liberal Arts program entitled Athens to Ferguson, and focusing on questions of justice, race, and urban life. And let me, before I get into my introduction of our speaker, mention that we are here obviously today. We will also be in this room 2 weeks from today, but next week we are back to the first room, Lab Sciences, where we were last week. So please bear that in mind. Anyway, our topic this morning particularly is what, despite the many challenges, can make for a sustainable, complex, multiracial city. And to address this question, we're very fortunate to have with us John Hoal, a leading figure locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally in architecture and urban design. John was raised and educated in South Africa and worked in urban revitalization there before coming to St. Louis and Washington University in 1989. He is chair of the Masters in Urban Design program and associate professor in the School of Architecture, also founding principal of H3 Studio, a national and international planning, design, and research firm. He has projects all over and is in demand as a lecturer truly around the world. His work has won more than 60 awards in planning and design from the American Institute of Architects, the American Planning Association, the American Society of Landscape Architects, and others. And his Confluence Master Plan, that's the one that many of you have probably seen at the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, was selected by the Secretary of Agriculture as one of only 3 projects presented at a World Summit on Sustainable Development. Here in St. Louis, he has played a key role in all the most significant recent projects. Initially as Director of Urban Design for the City of St. Louis, such things as the Forest Park Master Plan, the Downtown Development Plan, the Gateway Mall, the Washington Avenue Loft District, the Multimodal Transportation Center, and many, many others, recent and ongoing. Basically, if it happened here in the past 25 years, John either suggested it, was consulted on it, or did it himself. And we are all, as citizens, beneficiaries of his work and very much in his debt. We're also delighted to have him here speaking on the subject of designing a sustainable future in a divided city, Johannesburg and St. Louis. John?
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Is this on? It's good? All right. Well, I'm pleased you chose this room, not outside, since it's so cold. And I'm pleased you chose this room and not Mardi Gras. So it's a very interesting thing. But I was thinking this morning that I actually ended up choosing the wrong cities to talk to you about, because Mardi Gras, we should be talking about New Orleans. And having worked in New Orleans since Katrina, you will realize how incredibly symbolic Mardi Gras is for the divided city. Because not only is the theatrical performance of Rex and everything all in relationship and a sort of reflection of the divided society, but the in fact root of Mardi Gras runs along the high ground within New Orleans, and it was actually the flood line between the Lower Garden District, the rich, the white, and Central City, where we worked for so many years and continue to work, which is poor and black. And so it's really very symbolic, and I'm sure many of you have spent hopefully years down in Mardi Gras watching it, and you will even see the difference of the people on either side, whether it's the Lower Garden District or Central City on the side. So in fact, it's really quite interesting that we ended up today talking about the divided city, and I thank Bob for inviting us to talk. Well, I'm ready. You can take the lights down when you're ready. I'm going to talk really about design and designing a city and designing in a city that is divided. And I'm not going to show you pretty pictures. You know, architects and designers always like to show you their latest buildings. Well, I'm not going to show you that. I'm actually going to do a very wide-ranging discussion, and hopefully we might get down to some projects. But essentially, I'm going to sort of reflect on my personal experience for a moment. Obviously, I was born in South Africa, so I witnessed apartheid in its best, and my family and I, we all immigrated off to New Zealand in response to segregation, family brought us back to South Africa, so it was a very interesting reflection before I came here. So as you can see, South Africa has not only had structural apartheid and separation by policy, it also really had it by design. And being a designer in a field which design contributed to separation caused great anxiety. And so moving here, you will notice that South Africa is one of the most uneven countries in the world, but the cities within South Africa become really the place in which segregation is reflective and intensified. So you always find in cities that segregation plays up higher than the national average. So arrived in St. Louis, and of course I didn't realize before coming here it's the highest segregated city in the country, and having a structured, formalized apartheid and essentially an unstructured, unacknowledged segregation here has been a very interesting dilemma and experience for me over the while, and working in between the two countries. And you can see that, in fact, between South Africa with a Gini coefficient of 0.65 and St. Louis with a Gini coefficient of 5.2, it's not that radical. One formally structured, one unacknowledged. And then having the experience. So really, what I want to talk about today is communities, and my belief that communities should be shaped by choice, not by chance. And every one of us have a chance, and this is where a choice, and this is where design becomes really, really important. So basically, we need to get involved and create communities, and this is the role of design in the community. So I believe design matters. And most times, you don't understand design. You understand design only when it fails. So with Sandy like this, we suddenly see the failure of design. We see the failure of the system of the city, and the social fabric, the environmental fabric, and the economic fabric fails. And this becomes important, and the design is finally revealed. So for us, certainly in St. Louis, Ferguson reveals a failure. It made it explicit. It made it visible. It's been here all the time, but it made it incredibly visible. And what becomes interesting for me as I sort of reflect on this, and you see images like this, obviously not only reminiscent of early experiences in South Africa, but actually early experiences here. And this failure of the city has been a systemic issue, right? Back, numerous generations as you begin to look. And the parallels are frighteningly similar when you look Ferguson 2014, St. Louis 63, right? So we've had them and we haven't dealt with them. And it always poses to me as a designer, why haven't we dealt with it? Is it just easier not to? And how then, what can design do? And this becomes an enormous challenge for us as designers. What can we do about really major structural issues in society? And as you begin to again reflect a 50-year gap between the two, it becomes really quite instrumental in seeing that actually the tactics haven't changed. The way we deal with people haven't changed. And this becomes really a major issue, and I've struggled with understanding this because the tactics are exactly the same in South Africa. So it's an international phenomenon. This is not just a local thing. This is something that's really importantly structural. And what becomes the role of design in a situation such as this? Well, it becomes, I think, really important. And as I've worked in town here, obviously we all know the role of Delmar Boulevard. So in fact, that what becomes really important in all of this is just a moment away from us. Yeah, as far as Park, yeah, we are. And there's sort of Delmar in the division of the line. And you can see the separation. In fact, the failure of the system is not just a social failure. It's actually about an environmental thing. It's about a physical place. It's about design. It's about how we design this. And this has led for me to really explore the role of design in this. And you can see the division between north and south on Delmar. And you can just see the social implications, the educational implications, income and real estate. And there's just vast differences on either side. And so you know, I've spent 10 years working in a lot of the neighborhoods in and around along Delmar and in North St. Louis, and you can just see the homicide rate basically on the dividing line between the North and South. A lot of structural reasons for that. And then, as you can see, much closer to home, here is the campus, there's Delmar, and you can see the division. So these issues are made manifest in the city. They are designed into the city. And is it structurally designed? What are the implications have become important? But social justice and environmental justice has really driven a lot of my work, obviously, again, in the two experiences of Johannesburg and St. Louis. So this poses for me, I'm sort of making 5 points here before we talk about some of the projects that we've done, but it's really a divided world of divided cities. And as an urban designer in society, I think our challenge is becoming greater as we move forward. So I'm going to now talk really a little bit more about some of the global contextual things. So we know precisely, no, this is not quite true, but roughly around May 23rd, 2007, we became an urban world. That means that the human species became predominantly living in cities. Cities became the world. Cities are more powerful than nations today. They drive a lot of the global phenomena rather than nations. So cities in some ways are the world. Urbanization is the most important trend of the 21st century. And the idea of urbanization in the implications of energy, of natural resources, but most importantly in human well-being is going to be fundamental as we move forward. And you can see that we're making very little progress on the human development side globally, right? The Human Development Index has really essentially remained much the same. So while we're beginning to deal with urbanization in the design realm and build cities, and we're not really building cities that are increasing the capacity of people to participate. And 4.2 people born every second, 1.7 dies. We have a net gain of about 2.5 people. So 9,000 people every hour, over 200,000 a day, 6.5 million a month are coming into the world. So by the time I'm finished here, we've got about another 12,000 people in the world. By the end, when I talk to the students, by the end of their careers, right, they're going to be 9.7 or up to 12 billion in the world. This is a radical transformation in their careers. So they're going to have to begin to deal with it. And you can see how quickly we're just growing in terms of exponential growth. So every second, 2 people join a city somewhere in the world. So we're growing cities by about 1 million a week. So every 2.5 weeks, we're basically growing a St. Louis somewhere around the world. Just imagine to think that as a design realm and as developers, we could ever build it in a manner that looks, for instance, like St. Louis. It's a complete impossibility. So the challenge is enormous when we're having this rate. And not only are people joining this, but more and more people from the rural areas are moving to cities. So by 2050, 70% of people in the world will live in cities. They're going to live pretty much in between small cities and larger cities, about the same percentage. But there is a fundamental difference. Most of the new cities will be in the developing world. And this is a really important part. So this is the urban population growth will be uneven as we move forward. So our growth of our cities, as you begin to see, Asia 60%, Africa 15%, and then Australia, Oceania only 1%, North America 5%. So the growth is going to be disproportionate in the world. So every month, 5 million people move to a city in the developing world. And what becomes really important is that developing world countries, cities will be mainly youth-orientated. Developed world cities will be mainly seniors-orientated. So there's enormous disparity in age and therefore implication on how one does the cities. So most mega cities, the cities that are going to be above 10 million, are going to be in the developing world. And you can essentially see where they are, right? That's where they're going to essentially grow. Essentially, South America at this stage has developed. They're not going to grow quite as fast as Asia, as India, and Africa as they move forward through there. So by 2025, of the largest 15 cities in the world, only New York and LA will be in that, right? And now we're going to see cities that we haven't seen before. Jakarta of above 38 million. Today, I think Tokyo is around about 32 million. So we're going to have enormous growth. And you can see, essentially, most of the cities are going to be in the developing world. So 95% of growth will be in cities in the developing world. And we're going to see the emergence of a new type of city. We've already seen it. It's just started now. It's what I would call the hypercity. Other people call it mega regions. But this is a scale of an area that's 20 million and above. So it's sort of, just think of it. It's how many times more than St. Louis. And the question before us, that's a scale that is, quite frankly, impossible to design. It's impossible to build in the speed in which it has to be built, right? So there's going to be a whole different cadre of leadership and capacity and things. There's going to be a different way of building cities. And we're not 100% sure how that's going to occur. But we now see the Hong Kong, Shenzhen area, the Pearl River deltas of 120 million. And you can see that. And then you can see essentially Japan is becoming one large conurbanization of about 60 million. But what's important about it is that, as I said to you before, cities are becoming the world. As these cities become larger and more focused, so their power is getting greater. They are becoming more superior in terms of power and influence than the nations in which they reside. So the 40 top cities will have each with over $100 billion that produces 66% of the world. So 40 cities will do 66% of the world's GDP. So their influence is completely disproportionate. And they're going to be immense places of innovation as we move forward. But in order to build these cities of scale, we're going to experience a level of hyperdensity that we haven't seen before. And this is going to become the new vertical slums as they move forward. And you can see, again, this level of density. Again, way more significant than the density, say, of a New York. And the slums are going to be, in terms, as I said, vertical. They're going to be on top of the high-rise buildings, all built through. They're going to be on the sides of them. And these are pictures from what they call the cage people in Hong Kong at the moment. And this is the interior of one of the shacks that are built 60 floors up. So, and in Sao Paulo, we've had the first high-rise building taken over, and the entire building is a vertical slum. So we're going to see a completely different idea of how we've understood it. And as you can see, in these large megacities, we're going to have really most of the poor and the youth. But what becomes important is the nature of this city. This city, is going to have a lot of the informal city. So you can see in the background here, the informal city in conjunction with the formal city. And with 1 in 3 urban dwellers coming to the city, the governments cannot keep up with building a city for this type of scale. So people are going to build their own cities, and that's what's happening. They're building their cities in every place they can find the points of least resistance, and essentially the self-built city will continuously overlap. Now, the self-built city is also going to grow way faster, right? So when you look at something like informal, the slum city in South Asia, the overall urban growth is, say, 2.9. But of that 2.9, 2.2 of it is in the informal city, the self-built city. So the most of the growth of the developing world will be in this form of urbanism. So we actually have 2 cities coexisting within each other's realm. And this is what it really becomes. It's basically within the planned territory of the city, we're going to have the self-built city. And those 2 things are going to exist, and they're going to have to exist, and we're going to have to find ways of understanding them. And we're going to have to find a way of how these two kind of coexist. Who lives here? How are they different to who lives here? What are their educational background? Or is this really ultimately going to reinforce the divide? So our challenge in the design of all of this is that actually you have no control of the design. That happens. That's where the formal designers have worked up to now. We have to start working here. And we have to start to work in a way that actually starts to say, you know what, the hard division that you see here, and the type of building that you see here, the type of amenities you see here, cannot remain completely segregated from this realm. And this becomes very important for us as designers. Will require us to work in very different ways. How will we have and facilitate some relationship between these two cities that are divided, that are only going to increasingly divide if we don't find ways to kind of work, overlap, and weave these cities into place. So the issues of social justice and environmental justice are really for us the challenge to the design. So although we as designers love to produce beautiful buildings, beauty in itself is going to be insufficient. We are going to have to find ways that these two things can weave in whilst making places that are comfortable and compatible for people as you move forward. This informal city that we have to cope with, right, are typically non-permanent. They're very temporary structures. They evolve over time. They're not built to any building code, so they're very susceptible to any of them. They, particularly wherever they choose to build. This is down in Mexico, and Mexico has a very peculiar type of law that if you build in a floodplain and you get washed out, the government will provide you a safe house. So every person who moves to the city in Mexico basically wants to build their first house in the middle of the river, get washed out, and then they get given a piece of land. It's a really ingenious and very rational way of making sure you get a house. So these really quite phenomenal idiosyncratic ways of working as you move through. But overall, the informal city substantially lacks the most basic amenities of clean water, of food, etc. So the economic disparities are played out through this urban fabric, through the manner in which we are designing cities. So urban design has to move and become about human development and human opportunity and capacity development, and it's an enormous challenge as we move through. But at least you think everyone's poor in a slum. People are amazingly rich in slums as well. So it has the diversity. In Diwali, here in Mumbai, right, you have, look at the annual estimated income from the slum. $1.2 billion of economic output out of the slum. There are people, professionals, who choose to live in the slum. There's rational decisions for doing it while they're working professionally. There are millionaires in the slum. There's a lot of exploitation, obviously, that occurs in the slum. But in fact, it is an enormous economic enterprise, often done differently, in the informal economy, not within the formal economy. But to think slum equals poor, poverty, crime, bad people is fundamentally wrong. There is a very rational decision-making process that in many cases occurs within that. When people have an opportunity to move, they make a decision whether they should move or they shouldn't move, right? And so it becomes a very interesting phenomena as you move through. And you take Mumbai, you know, the entirety of the city, 60% of Mumbai is informal settlements. Only 40% is formal design. Formally designed in the classic way we would think of city planning. So the 60% of Mumbai operates economically, has a social fabric. They're really quite vital places in many cases. I'm not suggesting there's not crime in both, right? But it's not all bad one and all good the other. There's amazing, interesting overlaps that are occurring. Unless you think that even in our cities here, the formal design, informalization isn't occurring. It absolutely is occurring. You can look at LA, you can go there, and I can show you how informalization is beginning to work in there, not only in the economic realm, but actually in the physical realm. So in many cases, people are sort of suggesting that Los Angeles will be America's first third world city, and will, at the same time, will be the world's future financial capital. So these two forms of urbanization that we try to make a hard line between is in fact not a hard line. It's actually operating in a completely different synergy, and we need to get on board and actually begin to work with these two components. And if we don't, the unequal city will cause tremendous unrest. There's a direct correlation between this notion of an uneven, unequal city and the potential for change and the potential for unrest. And that affects the ability for long-term sustainability. I'm going to sort of suggest to you that, in fact, social sustainability and issues around equity are at the absolute forefront of making a sustainable city. We actually know technically how to make environmentally better cities, right? We know technically how to improve the economy, but it's actually the human side of making cities that is going to be the most challenging part. So when you look at our cities, if you look at the Gini coefficient, the darkest color is the greatest difference. You can see how it's distributed throughout the country. And there's no accident that, in fact, we're starting to see whether it's the movement 360 for the environmental areas or Occupy Wall Street or the 99%. But equity has peaked, and typically, according to some economists, I'm not an economist, they typically peak before great recessions, and they have peaked. And the dilemma with that is that, in fact, you can see the disparity between the richest, the top 20% own 85% of the country's wealth. And the bottom 80% of the population own 15%. So there's a great disparity in it. It peaks at times of crisis as you move forward. But it's also about resiliency. It's also about not only how you come back from crisis. And you can see that, in fact, when you're in poverty, the ability to come back from crisis becomes more difficult. So with the increasing unequalness, we have to actually deal with the ability, in fact, to be able to recover from that. And that becomes very difficult. And then moving up the Gini coefficient into the world side, and you can see the sort of levels of unequalness sort of sweeping up through the developing countries. So we have the greatest unequalness where we're going to have the greatest population growth. And that's going to be a dilemma for us globally as we move forward. And we really, in some ways, have the global north-south divide between the developed and the undeveloped. And that becomes really important as you move forward. And it's a very interesting phenomena that the BRICS countries have decided to separate themselves from the World Bank and establish their own World Bank. Now, this is remarkable, right? The idea of the World Bank is bringing equity and equal development to countries throughout the world, and the BRICS, the developing countries, have said that hasn't happened, and we're going it alone. We're going to make our own bank. This is a remarkable thing that's happened in the last 2 years, and I think has really signified the differences at the global size. When we talk about sustainability, when we talk about sustainability, we cannot not talk about climate change. Whatever one personally believes, sort of, we've passed the peak of 400 particles of matter. This is becoming, according to scientists, the issue of safety, and there is substantial change. For us in the design of cities, climate change is going to be most acute within our realm. Just overly simplistically, think of the increased heat, the lack of rain, is all going to be concentrated as an impact within the cities. So the cities are going to become localized conditions of them. Cities also have their own climate. Overly simplistically, they do. There's a heat island in a city. And all of this is going to be amplified in it. So it puts a tremendous onus on us of how we have to begin to do this. and begin to consider this. And more importantly, when you think of how much cities have to be built, you can see the manner in which we build them. 50% of all CO2 emissions come from buildings plus transportation. So design matters here again. If we can rethink how we build, if we can rethink how transportation operates in this, we in fact could be doing some substantially different things. So actual design of the city has a tremendous impact, not only operationally, but in some ways from a capital and building perspective as well. And as you can see, there's enough evidence out here that in fact climate change has a greater effect on the poorer neighborhoods in there, right? So a poorer neighborhood, we're finding greater level of deaths in there from heat, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not just because they can't turn the air conditioning on, right? It's a little bit more than that. Those poverty neighborhoods aren't structured. They don't, for instance, just have a simple tree canopy. They don't have some of the basic amenities that make this happen. So the way we've allowed our people in poverty to live has, in fact, contributed to this. But climate change goes further. There's flooding as well and storm surge, and you can see the amount of millions of urban residents around the world that are that. And you think of where we've placed our cities. Cities are often at the edge of coast for the transportation transition. So we have an enormous impact. 15 of the 20 megacities are at risk from sea level rise. In fact, we're working on a project right now for New Orleans. How can we save New Orleans from sea level rise and the continued destruction of the wetlands? And if you look at the predictions over the next 50 years, if we don't do something, New Orleans will have the sea right next to its levees. There will be nothing left, right? And you can look at Miami, you can look at other cities. This is an enormous struggle as we move forward. It's happening in every major cities. But there's also furthermore beyond that, right? We already have impacts. 12 million people live in poverty because of climate change. Because again, the ability for people in poverty to come back from these events like a Katrina. I've had personal experience. The people in poverty, when they moved out of New Orleans and moved off, got shipped off to Atlanta, have chosen not to come back. They've chosen not to rebuild their communities. Those of wealth have chosen to rebuild their communities. So when you live in poverty, you don't have the ability necessarily to come back and rebuild. So you became basically further into poverty because of that, right? And then, of course, we only have to watch California and know what water-stressed areas mean. But if you really look at Africa, you'll see what water-stressed communities are doing. And this is becoming people going to ultimately result in millions of people migrating. And so one begins to think, the blue is extreme risk of environmental change. And there's going to be great migration in Africa, particularly in terms of dealing with climate change implications. So as we look at this, we know that this is all more acute in the cities and the dilemma with the cities, but basically, in some ways, a sustainable world will be won and lost in our cities. We're going to have to rethink how we design them. We're going to have to invest in this differently. And it's going to be very important that the social resiliency of people are going to be really fundamental. What this is doing is it's actually giving us a new paradigm of how we have to think about cities. So when we think of cities and climate, there's a new design condition, right? It's not only how much will the climate change, which is really quite unpredictable. We're not quite sure how it's going to happen, but we know something's coming. How vulnerable is the city in its particular position and nature to it, and how can it adapt? Because we know it's going to happen, right? This is not something that's not going to happen. So how can you actually design a city that come back? So it's a new frame of reference for us as we move forward. But if I've depressed you up to now, I wanted to try and encourage you, all right? Because actually, cities are fantastic places. That's why I love cities, right? 80% of future growth is going to be in cities. They are the amazing concentrations of social capital. When you put people in a room, they're amazingly inventive. They're incredibly creative. Things can happen. In fact, the very essence of a city is for people to come together and do something they couldn't have done alone, right? We all respect living alone in the rural areas and how we want to, but the creativity is when it's kind of mashed together and some chaotic process, we actually invent things. And cities are fundamental places of innovation, have always been, of arts, of culture, of science, of everything else. So, in fact, it's great. We've got to make great cities because that's the way we're going to work ourselves out of this. And when you think of like Tokyo, which has 28% of Japan's population, but produces 40% of its GDP, they're amazingly efficient. You put brilliant people together, make it happen, and everyone outperforms. And the developing countries, Lagos, 8% of the population, 30% of its GDP. And Lagos has 80% informal settlement. So here is what we would call a slum city producing this amazing amount of creativity and innovation. And it's really got to do with how people are and that interface between them. So, you know, they can be amazingly productive. When you think of the 40 hyper cities, 20% of the world's population, 60% of its economic activity, 85% of its technology. And the top 25 cities account for half the world's wealth. It's just really quite amazing. So how does this translate to us here? All right. We will expand in population. Obviously, we're not a developing country and we won't be doubling, but we do expand, right? And this is an important, important part. You're going to expand both by natural growth and by immigration, if all predictions are. By 2050, 80% of people will live in the metro areas. And what's going to happen, if predictions are correct, the larger metro areas are going to grow faster than the smaller ones. And we're seeing that already. So we're having growth of the larger ones, and places like St. Louis are remaining very static and the same. So you're going to get large metropolises growing much higher as you move through. How's it? And most of the urbanites, 1 in 3, will live in the 10 most populous cities. So we really will become a nation of cities. So even here, if you're noticing how influential some of the mayors of cities are becoming, they're becoming more influential than the governors of the states. And this is a trend, it's a global trend. In fact, mayors themselves are now starting to work globally, right? And the network, you think the mayor of New York and the mayor of Tokyo and London don't speak? They speak, they compete, they're watching each other. It's this amazing network when the range of the cities are in fact beginning to average. And you can see the aggregate metro output of the cities, $13 trillion from cities. It equals 86% of US GDP. So cities, again, are amazingly efficient places and are really instrumental. This is the most interesting part there. 50% of what will be needed in 2030 does not exist today. And you can see the statistics of what has to be built, etc. So what we're really going to do over the next 20-odd years or so is we're going to rebuild 50% of our cities. This is an amazing opportunity to rethink how we're building the cities. And certainly it's going to be an amazing opportunity to take on some of the challenges of the divided city. So the idea that, in fact, we can really think that there is opportunity to fundamentally rethink how we will live, and the ability to think that what we're trying to do is make great livable cities, quality of life, everyone be able to have an opportunity, there be equity, there be accessibility. We can be resilient to whatever environmental changes are going to come, extreme weather, whatever, and social resiliency and economic resiliency being fundamentally integral to all of this, and basically rethink of how we're working for the long term. At the moment, in some ways, cities are designed incrementally based upon a real estate pro forma. And if you're in the commercial, you want to be out of there in 10 years. If you're residential, you want to be out there in 30 years. Right? So we have a very simple time frame. We don't have a multi-generational long-term time frame of making cities. And when we have to rethink some of our infrastructure costs, we cannot capitalize them on these short-term things. So we're going to have to move to a longer notion of how we do it. And it's going to be, in some ways, if we can think, it's got to be with and for the people. But what we have to do is we have to know kind of where we want to get to, and then think back to where we are and work out how to get there. It's not a question of do we have the money or do we have the thing. We have a lack of vision. What we need to do is we really need to understand what our cities want to be and what we want our cities to be, and then go out and make them. It's not an issue that we don't have the ability to do that. So one of the interesting things working between Josie and SDL is what can we learn from the developing world, and what can the developing world learn from the developed world? And how can the way we make cities and the challenges we face, how can they begin to overlap? So I'm going to start off looking at Josie, and I'm pretty sure most of you have some familiarity with it, but in terms of just South Africa in the country, it's about 1/8 the size of the USA, so much significantly smaller. And in terms of capacity, it's very diverse. It has 11 official languages, and they split all through the country. It has grown enormously from 7 to nearly 45 million people. And it's grown mainly in its cities. It's had a tremendous growth in its cities. And of course, freedom came in '94, and brilliant. And Mandela, absolutely instrumental and a significant leader, put together a reconstruction idea. And this was part of the ANC's program for rebuilding the cities. And this has been instrumental. And essentially they said, structural apartheid, we have to rebuild the city, completely rebuild the city as a place of equality. And if you looked at the Constitution of South Africa, it's a remarkable constitution, really about equality and dealing with the human side of things. And so the aspirations of the Rainbow Nation was developed. An enormous amount of investment has occurred, right? But there's still, even today, after all this time, there's enormous lack of adequate sanitation, proper housing, etc. in South Africa. And although poverty has been dealt with somehow, the gap between the rich and the poor is now wider than it was under apartheid. So it's more extreme. So as the investments happen, as the aspiration of building cities of equality and equity have occurred, it's actually increased division as we move forward. And 40% of the poorest own less than 7% of their household income. And you can see red is the poorest, so Black Africans are the poorest group in Indians, and then you can see the blue is where the wealth is, and the whites, and in Asians, and the beginnings of Black Africans' wealth. So you can see that, in fact, 40% of South Africa is still officially poor after all this time, after a really aggressive campaign to right the injustices. And so it's an enormous challenge in dealing with a structurally unequal system that's emerged from colonialism as you move forward. And so you can see the Gini coefficient. This is 1980. In fact, the divisions have got larger into 10. So it's been a really kind of a dismal reflection on the aspirations of all of us of trying, and all the commitment to try. And then even when you think of the number of households, we still 2.5 million households thing. So it's made pause for the government to rethink a little bit. And they've realized, in fact, that they can't keep with the amount of migration. They just cannot keep up with building housing and building cities to overcome structural inequity as you move through. So when you think of Johannesburg today, there's still two Johannesburgs, Josie and Egoli, right? Two very distinctive ones. And this is Johannesburg, and Egoli is Soweto. And we've made and designed cities differently for the different groups. And this was a condition. If you look at Johannesburg, it's made up of essentially a Western notion of ideal of the block, and you see, and this is Soweto. We make it very differently. And so we we make visible the differences in the structure of how we design. And this is the layout of Johannesburg. There's downtown Johannesburg at the moment there. You'll see this is the gold reefs that run through Johannesburg. So the only reason Johannesburg's where it is because of the gold reefs that runs through there. And essentially on the one side of the gold reefs, the whites lived, and on the other side of the gold reefs, the blacks lived. And the gold reefs, the economy separated the two as you move forward. And if you look at it again here in the broader regional area, you can see downtown there, the gold mines run through there, right? You see the differences. There's an occasional black community to the one side. And here again, you can see the main economic centers, and then the gold reefs there, same thing here. So the whole part of this, quite frankly, results in the dividing line like this. Is downtown Johannesburg, Soweto on the one side, gold mines coming through here, and as you move essentially west, right, you move up this line of increasing wealth away from the core as you move through. So there's some similarity of patterns here you're seeing. But what's important in all of this was structurally designed. And you can see, I'm not going to give you entire history of apartheid, but this has been the challenge for me. There's the designers using this. And the designers used the philosophy, exactly the same design philosophy that underlied Levittown here, underlied all the Newtown movement throughout America. It was used by the designers, but misused in terms of making an unequal society. And becomes a really interesting philosophical challenge, an ethical challenge to architects and designers. How can the same methodology, the same system be misused and then used for democracy as you go through? But you will see the implications. This is the apartheid city. Actually, it was based on the sector notion of the city that came out of this Chicago school. And what you did is you had your downtown, which was the economic center. Remember, we all had central cities here, downtown cores as an idea. And this side, you had the highest income, white going this way, middle income, Indian, and then black African, and all of this was industry. And if you look at these images, very much about the similar suburban movement as here. Again, you can see the structure of the town. Now, you can pretty much draw a diagram like this of virtually any city in the world today, because these dividing lines, be it Del Mar or any other, are very visible in most cities. And you can diagram the structural separation of people and unequal development. And it's played out often in different house designs, which you begin to see here on the left here. There was an entire research on what was the minimum dwelling size people could live in, right? And this was an international movement that played out in South Africa, and that was the minimum dwelling size for family that you see here. So essentially, Soweto and the major black townships in South Africa were made based upon this rather international theory and misuse. So how does a country and a government who's trying to overcome this type of designed apartheid, and they attempted to do this by building what they termed the equal city, but they haven't been able to keep up with building it. So we, at the moment, are looking at one very interesting notion of the dividing line here between Sandton and Alexander. Sandton is the major sort of commercial hub now of Johannesburg. All the major, it's the 1 square mile of Sandton is the richest square mile in sub-Saharan Africa, with every major international corporation that's in Africa located there. Alexander is very interesting. It's the only township in which, for a long time, black Africans have been able to hold land and actually own land, right? established in 1912, but basically they have been able to have land ownership there. And that has allowed these two conditions of poverty on the one side and rich on the other have made two very distinctively different cities. And they exist side by side. Side by side, and there's very distinctive, and there's a freeway separating the two. What becomes interesting, there's a thing, this is Sandton, yeah? This is Alexander, you can see here, there. They built an industrial area between the two, and they built a freeway through there. How reminiscent is how you separate groups. You build industry, different use, or you put a freeway between the two. You make a dividing line. You make a firm dividing line. The dilemma is, this is an enormous amount of work opportunity. There you can see the dividing line. And so 10,000 people every day walk from here along this route to get to here and back again. 5 Ks. Winter, rain, sun, they walk. There's only one way to walk, that line. Everything else is walled off. And this is what the walk looks like at the good time. Everything's walled off here, and you walk along here. You have to cross the freeway. There are the tracks as you walk through here. This is what you experience here. And these are all the folks that are working in those international office buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And the designer's response is, oh, they need a bridge. They need a really cool bridge. All right? No. So this has been the dilemma that myself and our students have been doing. But one of the most interesting ideas, obviously, that has been unacceptable to the Johannesburg government, and they've been brilliant about it. And what they've done is they've decided that the most important thing to do, since they do not have the capacity to completely rebuild the city in a manner that's equitable, is accept a level of unevenness and unequal development, but ensure people can move between them. In other words, because you live in different places does not mean you cannot use those places. In fact, one way to overcome this is to overcome segregative transportation policies and make mobility the very means by which you can overcome spatial divides. And so they've developed this idea of the corridors of freedom, what they call it, and there's a whole range of them. But they come up and they come into Alexander, and there's the walk and Stanton and all of this. So the idea is if you can use transportation, not like the idea of mobility. If people can comfortably move between places they work and the places they live, et cetera, we can actually reform the cities. So the idea that the way we think of transportation, where we put transportation within our cities become instrumental in how we rethink our cities and how cities can become places of integration. This is a really very important thing for us as designers, and they've chosen one particular city, one particular avenue, and the idea is they take it and they put transportation down the center and rebuild mixed-use corridors that basically link areas that are different together. Very interesting idea. And that the idea ultimately is that they will transform the entrenched settlement differences or places that you are, right? And basically allow people to comfortably move between them and use transportation as a... So what could St. Louis use from it? Well, you all know the whole history of the Metro Link. And there's a very interesting history if you wanted a social justice issue of view on that. But what is important is that as we look at our region, not all of our region is declining. There's lots of concentration and development and growth in there, particularly in the Central Corridor, remarkably just around transportation, interestingly enough. But we were involved in doing the City of St. Louis's first sustainability plan, and one of the key things residents said to us as we polled them, good public transportation. safe streets, walkability, becoming really important, mobility becoming ultimately fundamental. So in this process, we started to think of how could we take this notion of corridors of freedom to overcome division. And as you well know, the line goes west as transportation. So what happens if you go north-south? You cross the division, right? And you start to make this, think of this, South African example, that we can start to have communities that are incredibly segregated from each other, actually joined by transportation, and rethink the way in which we move in our city and we link jobs and residents as we move through. So we've done a very detailed study of looking at all of those areas. And this would be, for instance, an on-surface right through the center of some of the neighborhoods. And we've developed ideas in terms of what that could mean for adjacent development. Just if you think that Central Corridor is redeveloping now in relationship to the transportation, what could happen at some of the neighborhoods as you move through. I'm not going to go through in detail because it's really the principle here that matters. And then, interestingly, we spent some time down in Cherokee, South St. Louis, and there's the Lemp Brewery here, and Jefferson Avenue could be it, and how you could bring in series new forms of housing and begin to link that with the arts. And if any of you know the area well, you know it's really an emerging arts area. Very creative, young folks are there. Great diversity of folks is really becoming a hub of great ethnicity as you move through here. So we spent a lot of time working with the community down in this area. And it became very interesting, particularly as this all evolved. The role of the arts became very important because, in fact, there's a very interesting local creative enterprise that's emerging in this section. So how could the idea that you use transportation, you foster development around with the diversity of people that then ties to the notion of innovation, cities being places of innovation. Ultimately, how can you use transportation, the creative arts, to make places that are innovative? And clearly that's beginning to happen down there. So this idea of, excuse me, how arts and artists and innovators can actually start to rebuild cities and rethink cities. We thought, well, what happens if we took an idea like that back to the Great Walk? How if you 10,000 people are moving up and down there every single day, how can we kind of stop them? How can they start to collaborate differently? How can this begin to emerge? So back to the Great Walk and the corridor of freedom that you see, and Alexander on one side, Sandton on the other side. How can we capitalize on that in a very incremental way? And the series of places and links that we started to do, but ultimately with the vendors and the economy, this is how you shop today. The idea that we could come in and start to build with them a whole enterprise, essentially a main street, that this could evolve over time. So this was the start in which, instead of them sitting on the sidewalk, we can actually start to build infill buildings that ultimately can be places they could exist. And then deal with some of the broader social issues within the settlement patterns, how we could start to rethink and build new complexes in here. This was an example of a small-scale library, that how can that become a community center within Alexander and be part of it. But this be part of the Sandton Library system, so that they can actually move out of the barriers and be part of it and begin to integrate the communities. You can see it again there. And then finally, to begin to rethink how you could build public space in a civic center outside of Alexander on these corridors of freedom that really were about the amenities people would need that can begin to overlap. And here's an idea of the community center and recreational and basically a hotspot innovation center as you move through. And this is the idea that you could actually be in the middle of Alexander here and have a really phenomenal community infrastructure looking out towards Sandton as part of it. And these two things could begin to overlap. And you could embed the types of things you think in one area actually in the center. So how does this all work? How does it matter? I think design matters when it comes to social justice and environmental justice. And we're just working on a project not far from here, and I want to just leave you with the dilemma. Here we are. Here's the north-south line. Here's our divide line. And right here is the city of Wellston. The city of Wellston is the poorest city in our region. Right? Has a population 2,300. You can see how much it's lost. The income per capita is $6,000. Right? It is the poorest community. And we are working in the community trying to develop a plan. When you think about it, age becomes an issue, work, right? And this is the condition you live in. And this is 15 minutes walk from here, across the dividing line. Nearly 40% of the population is under 18. The school system's completely discredited. They cannot attend it. Predominantly female household. The challenges are unbelievably enormous as you move through here. And it's 25% of the city is public housing. Huge amount of crime. Right? And this is quite an amazing community. We've been working there for a year, meeting with all the community members. And we're trying to begin to think of a choice neighborhood plan, how we can actually begin to work with the community, develop their own capacity. The resources are unbelievably limited. And the challenge, quite frankly, is here is this community on the other side of it, the dividing line, 15 minutes from here. And we basically said, as a collective society, you're on your own. Bring back your own city. Quite frankly, it's an impossibility. This level of poverty, this level of destruction, it's got to be a broader discussion. And what opposes to me, ultimately, is how, as a designer, and how we, as a collective, can accept, knowingly accept, that these communities exist, and we say to them, you're kind of on your own. And in my mind, the community collectively should not be able to accept this. We should be able to say, as a collective, as a city, as a collective city, that in fact we have to overcome some of these divides to us and give everyone the ability to have the right to the city.